Please go ahead.
Welcome to the AI Safety Reading Group. This is our 210th presentation. And today we're doing something a little bit different. We're doing a presentation on locating ethics in human activity, a framework for introducing ethics. And we're reading Hannah Arendt's via Activa. Unfortunately, in this presentation, there will not be time to directly discuss AI safety issues, and so this will be left to the discussion. First things first, in order to discuss ethics, we have to accept some notion of free will and human freedom. Without free will and freedom, ethics is meaningless because we will not be able to argue that people have guilt or responsibility, which are two sort of prime things that we need in order to have ethics. So Hannah Arendt, that's the book, The Human Condition, from which the first chapter via Activa comes from. Arendt was born in 1906 and died in 1975. She described herself as a political scientist and not a philosopher, which many people have, but she disavowed that, saying she was not looking for philosophical answers, but instead she was looking to understand how human society was structured. She was a student of Martin Heidegger, the famous 20th century philosopher, and he said of her that she was the best student I've ever had. Her PhD thesis was Love and St. Augustine, 1929, with her supervisor Karl Jaspers. And her main concern is, how did we fail in terms of the catastrophes of the early and mid 20th century, and how do we not fail? The first major work was Origins of Totalitarianism, which confronts that head on. And then she wrote another series of pretty major works, The Human Condition, from what we're reading, Between Past and Future, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and Responsibility and Judgment. For this presentation, we're going to look at three major aspects that's talked about in The Human Condition, which is labor, work, and action, and what those activities mean, or action and speech. And to understand them better, we're going to supplement with some ideas from Origins of Totalitarianism, Responsibility and Judgment, and Between the Past and Future. Arendt was, just some more info about her, was friends with many great thinkers of the time, philosophers, novelists, theologians, and artists, and the like. And so this is some of her friends. Particularly her friend Theodor Adorno and her both German Jews who fled Nazi Germany, who considered themselves thoroughly German and thoroughly within the tradition of German intellectual culture and artistic culture, asked the question after World War II, or even during the rise of Nazism, how did we get from Immanuel Kant, the great German or Prussian moral philosopher, who is considered one of the greatest moral philosophers for Western civilization, how did we get from Immanuel Kant to Adolf Eichmann or other Nazis, and his picture of Eichmann in his trial in Jerusalem? And one of the great ironies of going from Kant to Eichmann is that, in fact, as part of Eichmann's defense, he quoted Immanuel Kant and Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative and said that he was only doing his duty in terms of Kant's categorical imperative in order to fulfill the Nazi wish of exterminating the Jews. So this was a big question. So Arendt asks, primarily, what is the location of our success? How do we not do this? How do we not have total failures of societies? And Adorno, her friend, asked the opposite question of what is the location of the failure of these societies. And so we'll be looking at, or trying to find the location of our success. So Arendt's key concepts that we're going to be looking at are these. So these are, these are Arendt's key concepts that we'll be looking at. And just to let you know, she uses these words, although they seem pretty ordinary, in very specific ways. So we're gonna primarily just define them and see where it goes. So, okay, so there is the world, There is Earth, it's chilling Yong, and there's us humans. And so we are born into natality. And so this is natality in terms of specifically human birth. And as we can see, this baby is subjected first to labor. Over here, we can see labor. And so labor is all of the eternal necessities that we will need from our birth until our death. We can see, feeding, sleeping, and cleaning as these recurring eternal necessities. We are also subjected to objects of work. So these are physical objects. You can see here the bathtub, the rubber ducky and stuff. And so these are impressed upon us as a child. But our first engagement with humanity, and this is what natality is all about, is in terms of speech. And we engage with speech in terms of the plurality of people of the human world. And plurality is different from multitude. Plurality is specific in Arendt's writing, that it is we are plural because we are the same in terms of indeed our structure of our bodies and our brains, but we are completely unique and individual, and this is demonstrated through our use of speech. We all speak in totally different ways. So the first involvement that the baby has in terms of the human world, an active involvement, because this is passive involvement, it's pressed upon the baby, is in regards to speech. All right, so let's look at labor. Labor is all the things of necessity to the reproduction of life. That labor is categorized as being perishable, it's cyclical, we experience it as cyclical, and because it is never ending, we must always do it, and it only ceases upon death. So here we can see we grow food, we eat it, we sleep, we clean, we have to maintain things. So anything you can think of that has these aspects of necessity, of being perishable, cyclical, and only ceasing upon death and needing it from day one, those go into the category of labor. So our next category is work. Work constitutes all the objects of the human world. So the human world is separate and different from the natural world because unlike the natural world where it's just a whole bunch of different organisms and different things coming together to do their thing, we use our imagination to determine what kind of objects, what kind of world we're going to live in. And the objects of our world are imperishable, unlike the objects of labor, where we need them continuously. And they have a longevity that outlasts our lives, at least in principle. So here we can see tools, clothing, furniture, houses, that sort of thing. But in proof of the imperishability of work, we also have the pyramids of Giza, the Chauveau Cave, and an indigenous painting from the Kimberleys in Western Australia. The Chauveau Cave and that painting are estimated at about 30,000 years old, or Chauveau Cave is about 27,000 years old, but the Kimberleys are 30,000 years old, and the pyramids of Giza are 4,500 years old. So we're talking pretty significant longevity. Next, we have action and speech, and Arendt says this is the foundation for all human interaction and community. This is what binds us. It involves the whole community. The speech must involve the whole community in terms of it must be communicable between all of us. And action is slightly different. Action and speech both only last for as long as they're occurring, and they leave no trace except in memory, unlike the objects of labor, which are imperishable, and objects of work, which are imperishable and stick around. Action and speech we only witness in the moment, and we can only remember them unless we then turn them into a piece of work, in a book, in a film, whatever, and then we lay them down. The special thing about action and speech is that or particularly action, is that it's an injunction against mechanistic processes. What this means is that societies get into mechanistic processes like markets or like the feudal system of serfs and aristocracy and whatever, and action comes along and provides a whole new thing to that society. It provides an injunction or a change or a schism within the mechanistic processes of the society that would just keep carrying out. Action and speech is also unique. It can never be replicated in its exact form, unlike objects of work that we can, in fact, replicate. So here we have some examples. MLK, Martin Luther King, with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So action here, it involves the whole community, because in MLK having his civil rights demonstrations all throughout the 50s and 60s, he changes the whole of American culture by doing that, and in fact, in some ways changes the world as well. We've got another example, a more personal one, of a person feeding the poor. That's is an injunction against the mechanistic process of poverty. Another example, we've got the Roman Senate deciding what the Roman Republic is going to do. And so even though you could say, well, but this is part of society, this is an institution, but if you have democratic process, as they did, the Senate can decide what direction the society is going to go in. So the society is no longer simply mechanistic, but you can decide where it's going to go. We've got here Alexander the Great fighting the Persians. So war is a form of action, changes both his society and the Persians and the world. And lastly, we have Diogenes of Sinope sitting in a barrel with his, living in a barrel with his lamp and living with dogs. And he's probably one of the exemplars of action that we know of throughout Western history, who was a crazy philosopher who did everything he could to disrupt Athenian society. And boy, did the Athenians not heaps like that, but they found him worthy of remembering. So this is the via activa. We have labor, work, and action speech. So there we've got labor. Got work, this is the schematic we're going to use to try to understand, by the way, where are we locating ethics. We have work, it creates these tools, which has this property of going back into labor again, so we can see this relationship. But work has this odd thing of, well, once it's made tools, why don't we make tools to make those tools? And if we let it keep going, then why don't we make tools to make the tools to make the tools, and so on infinitely. So work, although it can make objects that are imperishable and standalone, it also has this logic where it can just repeat itself endlessly, kind of like labor. So then we have action and speech. Here's Diogenes performing a great moment of action and speech that we should all remember, where Alexander the Great, hearing of Diogenes living in his barrel, came and visited Diogenes and thought of him as a great man. You know, what an interesting guy that he lives in a barrel and does whatever he wants. And Alexander the Great says to Diogenes, Diogenes, what can I do for you? I own the entirety of the world. What can I give you? And Diogenes responds, Alexander, you can get out of my sunlight. You're making shade. And Alexander responds, my God, if I was not Alexander the Great, I would be Diogenes. And Diogenes responded, if I was not Diogenes, I would also be Diogenes. And so this great event was considered worthy of remembering by here we have the plurality of people. And so they made a work out of it. And through the memory of the plurality of people and this work, we get immortality. And that's what immortality is in Arendt's view. So we've got the logic of labor. Here we have the cyclical process of labor. If all goes well, you get old and then you die. However, if you run out of food or you can't get access to food, you end up pretty hungry and starving, and then you die. There's an interesting thing about the logic of labor, though, which is that if we add in food back into this starving equation, that now we have a starving person, it doesn't actually equal life, because you might end up in this awkward situation of being in one of those two cars, and then you end up dead again. And so we have to say that the logic of labor, the truth that labor can tell us, labor's truth, is that a person minus necessity equals death, but not a person plus necessity equals life. We can only say that a person plus necessity equals possibility, the possibility of their life, their action, their uniqueness, which is terminated and they no longer have any possibility upon death. So here we have the logic of work. That work, we have this process where we build a tool, and isn't that great? We have this imperishable tool. The logic of work is a means to an end. And on the right side, we can say that we can see that with a goal other than itself, it produces some of the most exceptional human achievements. Here we have Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, and at the bottom we have the flag on the moon, which is pretty epic. However, if it doesn't have a goal other than itself, say beauty or religion or going to the moon or whatever, it becomes, it sort of cannibalizes itself in a way, because it becomes a means to an end, which only ever becomes another means to an end, which becomes another means to an end, which becomes another means to an end, and it repeats itself endlessly and thoughtlessly. So this is a problem with the logic of labor that we have to keep in mind. Moving on. So being in plural, what does it mean being in plural? Here we have Socrates, and he wants to hang out with some people. He wants to be in dialogue with others. That's what being in plural means. And so he then goes and is hanging out with his friend, being in plural, and he asks in conversation, what is the essence of bridge? Because he's interested in speech and dialogue, realizing that that is the essence of being in plural. And he's noticed that there are many particular bridges that we can encounter. These are all these bridges that he's noticed. He wants to know what the essence of it is. So in speech shows us that we have two particular ways of thinking about concepts. One, which is that we take all of the bridges that we know of and we reduce them to their minimum qualities before they cease to be a bridge. And out of that, we get the schematic. That is our schematic thought form. And another way that we can do this is that we look at all of our bridges and we think, this one at the top is the most wonderful bridge that's ever been made. And it's our ideal bridge from which all other bridges should be derived. And this is our exemplar or our example. But, of course, in practicality, we could say, well, the top's the most interesting, the second's the most grand. We can have exemplars of all different sorts of concepts. So that's the schematic thought and the exemplar. And what's important about this is that in using these, we tap into our inner senses to imagine, to use our imagination to experience something that is not currently present, which will be important. So being in plural. So here we have Socrates again, chatting with his mate and wondering about what's being in plural and what's it like to be one. And his friend says, you are one and I am one. And he goes home and he's thinking, I am one, because he's not quite satisfied with this. What does it mean, me being one? So he's thinking about it, and he's just thinking about it. He says, I am one. And this other little voice responds to him saying, yes, you are one. He thinks, wait a second, but actually I'm talking to myself. I'm two in one. And so this is, in fact, this is the aspect of thinking. Thinking is dialogue within ourselves, becoming two in one. So thinking is a dialogue with oneself. It's being two in one. It occurs in solitude. It doesn't occur in with others, relation to others, because you're having dialogue with them. It's got to happen in solitude. Even if you're with others and you start thinking, having this dialogue, you retreat from their presence into yourself before you stop thinking and come back to them. The word conscience, in fact, reflects this, as its literal meaning is thinking with oneself. But the key thing about thinking is that, as Socrates demonstrates throughout all of the Socratic dialogue, is that it doesn't produce any definite results or answers. Rather, it disrupts all given answers. As soon as we start thinking, we wonder, what is the bridge? And then we try and come up with our schematic. And then we think to ourselves, but that's not quite right. So we change it and we think of our exemplar and we're like, oh yeah, that's definitely the most beautiful bridge ever. And then we think, oh, but what's really beauty? And we start discussing that with ourselves, and so we never quite come up with definitive answers. And this is a problem, especially for Socrates, because the Athenians really liked definitive answers, and so they decided to execute him for causing such a ruckus. So, but thinking is key, because you get this you get a morality out of it, because we have to live with ourselves as being two in one. We have two dialogue partners within ourselves, and so this produces the first moral statement within Western history, basically, which Socrates says is not entirely true, but let's pretend. Where Socrates says, "It is better that I, being one, am in harmony with myself and to be against the whole world, than for me to be in harmony with the many of the world and against myself." So this is effectively the rule of non-contradiction as espoused by Aristotle, that was used in logic forever, but it's applied to yourself, because if you contradict yourself and you come into disharmony with yourself, then thinking, self-dialogue is no longer possible. You eradicate this, because a monologue is not thinking, just as a monologue between people is not a dialogue. And so you've got to keep your two dialogue partners within you intact. You've got to keep them happy and satisfied so they can communicate with each other. So Socrates' moral commandment essentially says, if the society, the rest of the world is asking you to do something that you really, one of your dialogue partners really rejects, is saying that if I did what is asked of me, I could not live with myself, and therefore I could not live with these two dialogue partners. One of them would be so distraught that it would either turn off or just argue continuously, and therefore I refuse to participate even upon the pain of death. But this is interesting, because similar to labor, as we saw that labor has just this negative logic rather than a positive logic, this produces only a negative ethics. But the good side of this is even a murderer doesn't want to live with a murderer, and we can in fact see this aspect of the two dialogue partners after the murders in Richard III's Shakespeare, which I won't read, but we can talk about some other time. So, will thinking save us? Well, no, unfortunately not. But thinking does keep our conscience alive, and without it, we are lost. Without thinking, Arendt says, we can become evil, which is not merely choosing to be bad, but possible of committing what she calls infinite evil, which is just continuous, arbitrary evil without thinking about it at all. So thinking, as it ultimately disrupts rather than posits, it does produce this negative ethics, which gives us a backstop. When stuff's getting really bad, we can say, look, I totally refuse to do this, even upon pain of death, like Socrates. Reason why I have Adolf Eichmann here, the man who spoke only in cliches and never uttered an original sentence of his own, as Arendt wrote in Eichmann in Jerusalem, is because in the Eichmann trial, it became very apparent that he did indeed only speak in cliches. Everyone recognized that there. And thus, Arendt said he was a man who did not think. He could not have a dialogue with himself. And so to him, the extermination of the Jews and being part of the Nazi party wasn't that he chose to be bad, but he just didn't think about it. He just thought, this is my job, and I'm going to do what's asked of me. So this is what she means of infinite evil, being able to commit these horrendous crimes without any form of conscience. At least Richard III, as we saw previous, had conscience. So the next thing is about opinion and judgment, because we're trying to find, okay, we've got a negative ethics, here's a positive ethics. This is the mirror of thinking. But unlike thinking, where you do it solitary, you are never alone when participating in opinion and judgment. So what's opinion and judgment? Well, it's formed by the imagination. As we found, the imagination earlier is about schematic and is about and representation involving our five senses. And it's about finding exemplars. So we use this to imagine other people's points of views, and we determine how we would feel, act, and think in another circumstance. Now, it's important, this is not empathizing. We're not emotionally empathizing with the person. We're retaining our uniqueness as ourselves. We're simply putting ourselves in their circumstances and saying, if I was in the circumstances with all of the things going on, perhaps even their body, how would I react? How would I think and feel? And so a opinion is the idea that, you know, everyone's opinion is equal in Arendt's view is totally erroneous. We have misunderstood what actually opinion is. She says there are different qualities of opinion, and the quality of an opinion or a judgment, because they're more or less the same thing, is determined by how many points of view one considers and integrates into forming their own opinion or judgment. And we can expand this to say, if I can think of, say, 10 people or 50 people that I can integrate into my opinion to form my judgment and to integrate their points of view in forming mine, I can then ask myself, out of these 50 people, who are those out of those 50 who have also integrated many, many points of view, maybe many more than me, maybe hundreds. And so I should give them preference because their quality of opinion is higher than the people out of that 50 group who say only consider their own point of view or maybe one or two other people. So we can see that thinking down here, it relates to the negative truth of labor, but opinion relates to the positive assertion of action and in some ways of work. So moving on, truth and certainty. So there's, if we go back, we should say that it relates to, these things relate to truth, but we should be clear, neither of these things are actually truth. They're assertions that we come up with. So what is truth and certainty, and why is truth and certainty left out of thinking in opinion? Well, because truth compels, as we've seen with the person who without food then starved to death. Well, you just simply need food. There's no other answer to that. It doesn't guarantee your life, but it is necessary. You need it. And on the other hand, we have so on the left, we have the certain negative truth of labor. On the right, we have the certain positive truth of work, in which we imagine the object and then we create it. That's the positive truth. But as it compels, it doesn't allow for thinking or opinion because we need freedom. If it compels, we can't do thinking because thinking disrupts continuously. We can't do that process. And if it compels opinion, then even though I can imagine a friend of mine, say, or someone I know who can integrate, you know, say thousands maybe of different people's points of view, if I rely on truth rather than integrating different people's points of view, I will perhaps eradicate their opinion and say that it's unworthy because they can't prove it to be true. It's not empirical. So whilst truth needs to be the backdrop of opinion and judgment, without truth, opinion and judgment are meaningless. If we just lie or if we just make up stuff, it's meaningless. But opinion and judgment are about points of view, not truth. And the fragility of points of view will be destroyed if truth is the sole arbiter. So freedom, this is perhaps the logic of action. Freedom exists in the realm of action and speech alone. As we've seen, the other two actions compel. So labor compels necessity, work conditions our world and our possibility. It also compels us, if left to its own devices, just to make more tools, to make tools. But action and speech is the realm in which we determine our existence and we can change it. Within action, the community and the self can enact its judgment, can enact its opinion, the judgments that it makes, and it can make them real. But the logic of action and freedom is that it's precarious and uncertain. Its results are never known completely. They can't be known. And inevitably, results will not be what we desire because we'll perform an action thinking that it's great, we've all decided, and eventually somewhere along the chain of events, the causal chain of events, something will go wrong and it will not at all be what we want. So how do we deal with this and not be terrified of action? Well, Arendt says we deal with it by forgiveness, because forgiveness is about reconciling the inevitably undesired outcomes of action and allowing for a fresh beginning. So this is why we have forgiveness as a human ability, to be able to forgive that we tried our best, we performed an action, and inevitably it had bad results anyway. The truth of action is factual truth, which is different from reason and stuff, which is that, and unfortunately we can't go into scientific truth and stuff like that because we don't have time. So I'm sorry about that, but the truth of action is simply its fact, that we remember it, and it's the most delicate and precarious forms of truth because we can in fact forget it. And if we forget it, then we forget our history as humans and the different things that we can do and the different possibilities available to us, and that's a problem. As I mentioned, it is terrifying. It is perhaps the most giddying and terrifying aspect of all human activity because it is so unknown. And many ethical and political frameworks and systems have sought to eliminate it in various different ways to try and remove the precarious nature of action and freedom, which Arendt says eventually, not immediately, but eventually, the more we try and eliminate it, results in totalitarianism. Because without freedom, we lock ourselves and our generations that come after us into a kind of perpetual state of adolescence where we can never grow, become fully human, enact our will. So we now ask the grand question of where is the location of ethics? And here is our schematic of kind of our simplified schematic of society, which I don't know how long I've been talking for, but I suspect enough. So where is it? Where shall we find it? And that's, I think, a difficult question. So this is my conclusion. Each human activity has its own logic and demonstrates a kind of truth. But truth compels and inhibits freedom. As ethics at the start, we've seen, requires freedom in order to confer guilt and responsibility, among other things. Ethics needs to be located within the realm of freedom, but we then have a problem. What is then to be done about labor and work? And I don't know. I think that Arendt would say, indeed, ethics needs to be located within freedom, but it needs to be able to deal with the difference of labor and work. And I guess that's up for our opinions and our judgments to decide. And as she was a dogged democratic in the ancient sense of the term, she would probably agree with that. So my closing thoughts is, this is an introduction to where possibly ethics fits into human activity. Many ethical frameworks unfortunately only fit into one particular area of human activity, and this is a problem. Some examples include utilitarianism is primarily in labor, normative ethics in work, virtue ethics primarily or almost exclusively in action, or deontological ethics is primarily within the individual or almost wholly within the individual, coming up with principles and not in plurality, so it's not there. So the difficulty that we face is in finding ethical frameworks that can negotiate the different areas of human activity and their different principles and maintain those different principles and the internal processes of each activity. So there we go, an introduction to trying to understand ethics. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for presenting.